And so this brings me back to Hamas, and I get a lot of questions about Hamas, and I observe a lot of misunderstanding about Hamas, where it came from, and what it's really doing versus what people imagine it's doing. Israel is clearly in violation of international law. There are UN resolutions recognizing Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian territory and the need for it to leave those territories, and for a settlement of this conflict resulting in a two-state solution, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. Israel refuses to recognize any of this. People in Palestine have a right to fight for this territory that is being illegally occupied under international law. And they also have a right to fight against Israeli aggression, which is constant. We just watched the Israeli government announce its intention to carry out multiple extensive war crimes, cutting off food, water, deliberately denying the civilian population medicine, and then indiscriminately bombing this densely populated urban environment. Those are deliberate war crimes, and they announced their intention to do all of this. And they enjoy complete impunity from the West, Western governments, most of the Western media. So there's no dispute at all whatsoever over whether or not Palestinians are justified in armed resistance. They absolutely are. The problem is that is not what Hamas is doing. Hamas is a creation alongside Israel of Western hegemony in the region. It's sprung from the Muslim Brotherhood, which has also been used for decades by the US to control the Middle East, the wider Arab world, even Egypt in North Africa. And Hamas was created specifically to get rid of any sort of strategically thinking, diplomatically oriented, rational resistance group for the Palestinian people. In other words, a Palestinian version of, say, Hezbollah, which a lot of people lump together with Hamas, but is a completely different organization with a completely different approach and completely different associations, diplomatic ties, and support in the region. And we hear the Western media declaring Hamas a terrorist organization, but at the same time, in the past, the Western media has admitted who is actually behind the rise of Hamas and why. So we have this article first from 2009, Wall Street Journal, How Israel Helped to Spawn Hamas. Hamas, to my great regret, is Israel's creation, says Mr. Cohen, a Tunisian-born Jew who worked in Gaza for more than 2 decades, responsible for religious affairs in the region until 1994. Mr. Cohen watched the Islamist movement take shape, muscle aside secular Palestinian rivals, and then morph into what is today Hamas, a militant group that is sworn to Israel's destruction. Instead of trying to curb Gaza's Islamists, from the outset, says Mr. Cohen, Israel for years tolerated and in some cases encouraged them as a counterweight to the secular nationalists of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and its dominant faction, Yasser Arafat's Fatah. Think about Hamas leaning more toward extremism versus a secular armed resistance in say Gaza or the West Bank, for the Palestinian people. How much easier it would be for the rest of the region to pour support behind the Palestinian people. Think about it, especially now, the way the world is shifting away from US-led unipolarism toward multipolarism. There's a reason that Egypt strictly controls what passes in and out over their border with Gaza, because Hamas, an outcrop of the Muslim Brotherhood being an opposition group that had overthrown the Egyptian government in the past and remains to this day a persistent threat to Egypt's political stability and national security. The US, during the Arab Spring, and I'll get into this more in just a moment, the US, during the Arab Spring, backed the Muslim Brotherhood in overthrowing the Egyptian government. in 2011. The article also points out Israel's experience echoes that of the US, which during the Cold War looked to Islamists as a useful ally against communism. Anti-Soviet forces backed by America after Moscow's 1979 invasion of Afghanistan later mutated into Al-Qaeda. But of course, that later mutation into Al-Qaeda served as the perfect pretext for the United States to invade nations all across the region, around the world even. And when they weren't using Al-Qaeda as a pretext to invade and occupy a nation, they used it as a proxy against nations they couldn't outright invade, or at least initially, including Libya and also Syria. And I want to point out how long this has been going on, and how, especially in regards to the Arab Spring in 2011, how the US prepared years in advance to achieve this. So we have this article from the New Yorker by Seymour Hersh titled "The Redirection. Is the administration's new policy benefiting our enemies in the war on terrorism?" The article says, to undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shia, the Bush administration has decided, again, this is 2007, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shia organization that is backed by Iran. The U.S. has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant version of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda, but only superficially. The rank and file are hostile towards America. Their leadership and the organization itself is receiving U.S. support laundered through America's Persian Gulf allies, at least at the time. The article also talks about the Muslim Brotherhood specifically, from which Hamas emerged. If the United States does try to move against Syria, members of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood would be the ones to talk to. This is a source that Seymour Hersh was citing. The Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, a branch of radical Sunni movement founded in Egypt in 1928, engaged in more than a decade of violent opposition to the regime of Hafez Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father. In 1982, the Brotherhood took control of the city of Hama. Assad bombarded the city for a week, killing between 6,000 and 20,000 people. Membership in the Brotherhood is punishable by death in Syria. The Brotherhood is also an avowed enemy of the US and Israel, but again, only superficially, because in reality, the Brotherhood helps advance US foreign policy objectives, which includes its support of Israel. All the way back in 2007 was setting the stage for the 2011 Arab Spring. There's another article, and I've gone over this many, many times, from the New York Times, 2011, U.S. groups help nurture Arab uprising. And this article, I'm going to go over it again, just so people are clear about what happened. The U.S., according to Seymour Hersh, all the way back in 2007, was preparing networks of armed militants. This New York Times article indicates the actual protesters, they were also organized years in advance by the United States. So it says a number of groups and individuals directly involved in the revolts and reforms sweeping the region, including the April 6th youth movement in Egypt, the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, and grassroots activists like Ethar Qadi, a youth leader in Yemen, received training and financing from groups like the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House, a nonprofit human rights organization based in Washington, according to interviews in recent weeks and American diplomatic cables obtained by WikiLeaks. And remember, if Julian Assange and WikiLeaks never revealed this to the world, we may never have actually gotten this New York Times article. The Republican and Democrat institutes are loosely affiliated with the Republican and Democrat parties. They were created by Congress and are financed through the National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up in 1983 to channel grants for promoting democracy in developing nations. The National Endowment receives about $100 million annually from Congress. Freedom House also gets the bulk of its money from the American government, mainly from the State Department. So I just showed you the map in the beginning of where the NED operates all around the globe, and what they do is political subversion. The article also says some Egyptian youth leaders attended a 2008 technology meeting in New York where they were taught to use social networking and mobile technologies to promote democracy. Among those sponsoring the meeting were Facebook, Google, MTV, Columbia Law School, and of course the State Department, the US State Department, which actually organized it. So Seymour Hersh was warning people that the US was building a network of armed militants as far back as 2007. As far back as 2008, the US State Department was preparing all of these activists to create the protests that would serve as cover for these armed groups to begin overthrowing or just destroying these countries, or both. This is where Hamas came from, this same network of support, the same network of interference, the same network of manipulating and interfering in the internal political affairs of nations around the globe.